بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. And my heartfelt thanks to Karima Foundation for putting on this event for us, and of course to Shaykh Yusuf for opening with this very penetrating historical insight that helps us frame some of the main concepts. And all of that is adding to my own thought process as I personally try to get to grips with some of these concepts and apply them to what I know about the Quran, what I experience of the Quran, what I teach about the Quran, because my primary field that I'm interested in is the field of tafsir. And that's why I've given the subtitle after I'jaz and science to In Defense of Tafsir. And some of you may know that my handle on the social medias is at Tafsir Doctor, right? And that was at first tafa'ul, that's to say optimistically, before I got my PhD, and then after that it became haqiqah. Alhamdulillah. So when I was 17, I did something very naughty. I published a book called Astonishing Facts of the Holy Quran. And actually, this was some work that I did, and it wasn't intended to be a book. It was a local Radio Ramadan series in Glasgow. And then I put it on a website that I had at that time. And then some Indian publishers found it, and they turned it into a book. And a few years later, my brother forwarded me this and said, "Is that your book?" And it turns out it was indeed my book, Astonishing Facts of the Holy Quran, in which I patched together some of my own work and various things found on the internet that talked about evidence for the truth of the Quran. And among those things, a prominent aspect was the scientific miracles of the Quran. And then I studied tafsir. And the repentance from this book is ongoing. That's why I have to do these kind of presentations to offset whatever happened since this book came out. And I begged the publishers to stop publishing it, but they keep reprinting it. So your duty now is to give me the promise that you will never buy this book. Okay, if you want to buy this one, that's fine. Okay, but this one here, I'm showing you only to warn against it, as the scholars did in the books of Mawdu'at, right? Only to warn against it. So the aspect that I still actually feel happy about when I look back at this piece of work was that it took a broader angle and a broader approach to this question of, how do I know that Islam is true? How do I know particularly that the Quran is true? Which is not the only way to know that Islam is true and that the Prophet ﷺ is true, but is a big part of it. How do we know that the Quran is true so that we can call people to follow us in the Quran? What do we want from all this discussion that we're having about i'jaz? Number one, to be convinced by the Quran. Number two, to be convincing to others who might not yet be convinced. And being convinced is not just a matter of, well, alhamdulillah, I've taken my shahada, I'm here in Karima Foundation. Obviously, I've done enough to get to this point. But iman and faith is something which grows, and something which a constant engagement with the Quran in the right way would cause our faith to continue to grow. And that's the case as I study, and it might be in preparation for some lessons that we're going to give or some lectures, and you delve into the tafsir and you think more deeply for your own self, and you say, subhanallah, this is the truth. This is a perfect book. This is a powerful discourse. This has got depths beyond what I knew before today, and depths which I'm sure I could never entirely exhaust. So that conviction is something that we want to always be nurturing, right? That's a yaqeen phrase, that nurturing conviction. And that is why we need to know about these things which we banner under the title of i'jaz. Now, these are some questions that are on my mind, and things that bother me, and things which concern me from day to day. So I'm going to put these questions out, and I might say something about them, but I want us to keep them kind of in the background of what we are going to be thinking about and what we are going to then discuss in the question and answers as well. The first of these questions is, should we accept weak arguments for Islam? Someone comes to your dawah table, your street dawah, you do some kind of linguistic jujitsu, right? And you manage to overpower them in the instant, and they say, okay, all right, ashhadu, and they say the rest of the shahada with you, and they have now become Muslim. And then we forget about them. But apart from these problems, is that the type of thing that we're trying to achieve? You know, you could argue it. You know, we're just trying to save people from the hellfire. Maybe after that, they will grow in their faith. But when doing that, is it okay to use arguments that are not actually accurate, that are not convincing to somebody else, but they were convincing to this person? Could we sometimes be convincing people who become convinced because of their ignorance? Because they don't know perhaps the possible counter-argument to what you're saying. Your argument might be very weak, but it's strong enough for one particular person. So is this a valid thing to be doing? Because, you know, if I were to give a talk about the miracle of the Quran that wasn't today's talk, and it was more out in the public, I'm assuming here people are a little bit more ready for some critical ideas. If you weren't, then you would have left after Shaykh Yusuf's presentation or during it. But the fact that you're still here means you're ready for this type of discourse where we want to actually do better. We want to do better as a community. We want to strengthen the way that we are going to present Islam to others. And in the first place, we have to strengthen our own perspective. Is a strong religion to be defended with weak arguments? Is the truth supposed to be supported by falsehood? That is to say, something like trickery, where I pull the wool over your eyes and I make you think that something was a convincing argument and you just didn't know any better, and so you accepted it. Have it done right? As you can probably tell by me asking the question, my feeling is no, we wouldn't have done right. And we should not accept weak arguments for Islam. And one of the main problems of it will be is that one day that person will hear the counter argument, and the structure that we built out of weak arguments will be like the house of cards that is blown over by the slightest wind. So we have to think very carefully about what we use to defend and promote Islam. Another question that I have, maybe we'll have some perspectives on this later. If we talk about the miracles of the Quran, does the Quran have one miracle? Does it have one type of miracle? And if we were to say we're thinking specifically about linguistic miracles, for example, is it one ayah that has a linguistic miracle? Or many ayat have a linguistic miracle? Are there 6,000 plus linguistic miracles? If we were to say, for example, in this ayah, I was so convinced by this argument and this point about this ayah, that was enough for me to become Muslim. We've seen this happening, and there's nothing strange about that. So is the Quran's miracle in one place, or is it a cumulative effect? So if we were to say, for example, one argument might not be convincing to everyone, but another one might be convincing to the other people. Is the miracle actually lots of smaller miracles that make up one big miraculous construct? Number 3, would we accept any attempt to replicate the Quran today? So we talked about the historical argument and how, in a way, that is a closed case. The mu'arada, the objection, the obstruction, the replication never happened. So that's a closed case. But now people are talking about, oh, what about ChatGPT and GPT-4 and GPT-5? Yeah? يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْجِبْتِ وَالطَّاغُوتِ, right? It's mentioned in the Quran, the GPT, right? Don't quote me on this one. Cut it from the record. Okay, so this whole idea that artificial intelligence will actually be able to replicate the Quran, will be able to replicate the Quran. People are actually telling me that, Dr. Sohaib, you need to do a course on this issue. Right now is the hot issue of the time, the ijaz of, versus artificial intelligence. And I wonder why artificial intelligence would be considered more powerful than the collective intelligence of the Arabs. So I'm not sure what the big deal is. But for me, there's 2 reasons that we should actually become more honest about whether this challenge is still open or not. Oftentimes in our dawah presentation, we'll say anyone can challenge the Quran at any time. But let's face it. If someone were to say, oh, actually, I have reproduced the Quran, what will happen? Is any one of us, and are we collectively as a community ever going to say, yeah, actually you win, you have replicated the Quran? There's two main reasons why this will never happen. Number one, because too much time has passed, really. And the Arabic language was built upon the foundations of the Quran. Shaykh Yusuf shared with us about even Nahu, and then especially Balagha. The standards have been set. This is why I asked the question about objectivity. Because in my view, it would not be possible now for someone to come using the same tools and the same language that was shaped by the Quran for all these centuries and say, I've managed to use this to construct another Quran. The time for that was when the Quran was still a new phenomenon, not when everything has now flowed out of the Quran in the whole of our Islamic history. The second reason we wouldn't is just because we wouldn't. We will always prefer the Quran and we will always believe in the Quran, and we're never going to have a quote-unquote objective reception of any attempt to imitate it. If it is too similar to the Quran, we'll say you're just aping the Quran. If it's too different, we'll say that's nothing to do with the challenge. We will say this is ineloquent, that's ineloquent. We will attack it from every angle. So that's okay. I'm not saying that we should welcome the challenge. I'm just saying we should perhaps be more straightforward about the fact that this challenge was closed with respect to the linguistic aspect, certainly. The last critical question which underpins things that I'm going to talk about is that we are maybe overusing the category of i'jaz to describe our topic. So every single beautiful thing in the Quran, people will say about it, and this is the i'jaz of the Quran. So something can be very beautiful, can be very effective, can be very powerful, can be very convincing, can be very perfectly structured. But we go straight to saying this is i'jaz. And that's actually okay, as long as we understand that we're using the term loosely. We're using the term as a catch-all for everything that is beautiful and makes the Quran, and makes the Quran the perfect discourse that it is. But there can be a danger in overusing this category, especially if people are going to invest it with all that weight of the technical meaning of the mu'jiza, as we were informed of in the last session. So if you take it in a more general sense that these things are ayat, they are indicative signs that make us feel that yes, this is from God. Not a self-contained argument, not something that would convince every skeptic, but perhaps more the thing that cumulatively lets us see, lets us understand, and lets us feel that we are reading and hearing the word of God. So overusing the i'jaz category, I would add something here. People also started to throw lots of things into the under the heading of i'jaz. So we have, for example, the preservation of the Quran, the miracle of the preservation of the Quran. Where did we get this idea from? You know, maybe sometime we can do an investigation as to where this first was talked about. The preservation of the Quran is, of course, a necessity, so that we know that the Quran that we have is the Quran, is the same revelation that came to the Prophet ﷺ. And yes, we believe in divine providence and guidance for this to have happened. But all those people who were preserving the Quran, they weren't doing so miraculously. They were investing effort by memorizing it, by writing it down, by copying it accurately, by preserving it from all its angles of its recitation and its writing, and documenting exactly what is in the Mus'haf and how it should be, and making sure that it's preserved. This is all by divine providence and by divine guidance, but not supernatural. When we talk about i'jaz, we're normally thinking of something supernatural. And then people are using that even as an argument for the truth of the Quran. See, it's perfectly preserved, and that means it's from God. But with a little bit of thought, it's clear that this does not follow. And then they started to talk about the miracle of the qira'at. And I started to ask, next it will be miracle of asbab al-nuzul, or miracle of nasikh and mansukh. These are categories of scholarly inquiry. These are ulum al-Quran, as we saw the branches of ulum al-Quran. And these are things that scholars do, and the way that scholars talk about what they do, and the way that they ensure that they are doing their duty towards the Quran. miracles, we need to focus on the things that really qualify to fall into this category. So these are some common weaknesses in claims of miracles. And here, I know that you're expecting me to talk about the scientific aspect, and I will, inshallah. But I wanted to perhaps just start with a slightly broader perspective. So when people say about a particular ayah and a particular interpretation of that ayah, that this contains a miracle, that this is part of the i'jaz of the Quran, this is a miraculous verse in and of itself. These are some of the things that happen frequently, right? This is almost like halal bingo, where when I see these things, I'll be like, okay, let's check off how many of these things happen in the claim. Number one, missing the point. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent his book with the purpose of guidance, right? He sent it with the purpose of guidance. And sometimes when people are giving an argument, like for example, they're reading a certain ayah in a scientific way, they are going away from what Allah Azza wa Jal intended us to focus on and the point that we were supposed to take from it. If you were to at least combine these two, then you are in safer ground. But sometimes people, they see as if the ayah came to make this point in order to establish this miracle later on, that, well, how could someone have known that at the time of revelation? Right? So a lot of these claims, they end up missing the point. Worse than that, they sometimes attribute ignorance, and in fact, a lot of the times, even out loud, they attribute ignorance of the ayah to whom? To the best generations, to the Sahaba and those who came after them. And God knows what they really think about the Prophet's knowledge, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of the ayah itself. Because they say, this ayah says something that no one ever could have known until the 20th century. Well, then I ask you, do you know something then that the Prophet ﷺ didn't know about the Quran? Usually they don't say this part out loud, but they often do say it couldn't have been known except with modern instruments. So certainly they are attributing this ignorance to the Sahaba. They are attributing this ignorance to all the generations that came in between, and they are proud of saying this. They're actually proud of saying this because this is the point. I'm going to share with you a few videos. You'll hear these things coming up again and again. So attributing ignorance, we can see that there's a problem here that we'd have to address, right? It could be that there are certain things that were not known to everyone, and the knowledge about the Quran could grow in certain ways. But a lot of the times these people are literally saying no one could have possibly known what this ayah was even talking about at all until we had modern equipment that could tell us, وَالسَّمَاءِ وَالطَّارِقِ. What on earth is a tariq? We have no idea. 14 centuries, and then someone records a pulsar with, that's it, now we figured it out. Literally, you're going to see a video that says this. Ad hoc arguments. This is another one of these problems that we have, including in the linguistic side. People will say, look how wonderful this wording is. If it had been anything other than this wording, لَاخْتَلَّ النَّظْمُ وَسَقَطَ الْفَصَحَةِ, right? The whole thing would have fallen apart. It would not be eloquent at all. I'm going to say ad hoc. I'll just give you an example or two. I was once in a circle with a teacher, and I'm just one of those annoying students. I would ask questions and I'd make problems. But this is how you become a good student, and inshallah one day, a good teacher. So you ask with adab, of course. And I did, inshallah. So he said, look, we were reading Surah Ali Imran, and Zakaria alayhi salam says, how am I supposed to have a child? وَقَدْ بَلَغَنِيَ الْكِبْرُ وَامْرَأَتِي عَاقِرٌ. When I have reached old age and my wife is barren. So the Ustad said, look at this adab, mashallah. See, he first talks about his own defect before talking about his wife. That would be rude if he had done it that way. So I asked, Ustad, was he rude in Surah Maryam? Where he says, what does he say? You can help me, Surah Maryam. No one memorized Surah Maryam? Yeah? وَكَانَتْ إِمْرَأَتِي عَاقِرًا وَقَدْ بَلَغْتُ مِنَ الْكِبْرِ عِتِيًّا. So this is again part of the fasaha and the tafannun in the Quran. The same thing is presented in two surahs in two different ways. If we were to take literally, the order in which things are mentioned, bear in mind, just sorry to blow your minds here, but Zakaria was probably not speaking Arabic. And by the way, this is like such a fundamental point that I think kind of goes under everyone's radar. When we talk about the i'jaz of the Quran, the i'jaz of the Quran often is quoting people's speech. Do you think, first of all, that they were all speaking Arabic? Some people do, by the way, but no, I don't agree with that. Number two, do you think they were all speaking i'jaz? And when Musa is arguing with Pharaoh, both of them are being mu'jiz to each other. Musa is saying mu'jiz words and Fir'aun is saying mu'jiz words in response. The Quran has given us this i'jaz discourse. And when it is presenting what people are saying, clearly that you have to then understand that it's not about reporting their precise speech. It's about reporting their precise intent in their speech and giving you even some of the things that surrounded that speech. It is perfect in the way it presents it, but not in the sense of it was like a tape recording that is played back. So why is it in one place it said, Rabbi Musa wa Harun, and the other place it said, Rabbi Haruna wa Musa? There must be a deep, deep reason behind it. Maybe. Or perhaps it is because each one sounds best in its own environment. This is the fasila, the rhyme in the surah. For some people, this is like blasphemy. Why are you saying that it's about rhyme? Well, because that's part of what makes the Quran perfect and beautiful. The sound of the Quran is part of what makes it beautiful. We talked about this. So why is it so strange to say that in one place Allah Azza wa Jalla reports what they said as Rabbi Musa wa Harun? In the other place it reports it as Rabbi Haruna wa Musa. Do we have to then go and say, actually half of the magicians said Rabbi Musa wa Harun and half of them said Rabbi Haruna wa Musa? Some say this. Or they said it one way and then a few minutes later they said it the other way. Some people say this. It gets complicated. So ad hoc argumentation is where you say it had to be this way and couldn't have been another way, and then you end up falling into some problems because you then attribute the very thing that you said couldn't happen, and then you say, oh, actually Surah Maryam now, I've made it not have balagha or not have adab. There was one person who posted online about there's no Ya Rabb in the Quran because Ya is for Nida al-Ba'id. You can count the mistakes here. Number one, yes, there is Ya Rabb in the Quran twice. Number two, it says Ya is for Nida al-Ba'id. This is also mistaken because it's actually the Aslun Nida, right? It's just basically the main thing that you use to call someone is Ya. It doesn't have to imply them being far away. But this person said there is no Ya Rabb in the Quran because Allah said, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ. When my servants ask you concerning me, then I'm near. So if Allah had reported in the Quran, Ya Rabb, it would have contradicted this ayah. Subhanallah, subhanallah, subhanallah in the comment section, right? But actually on this particular day, my ummah was switched on and they asked him, Shaykh, but I don't think anyone pointed out, Ya Rabb is actually in the Quran twice. But they said, but in the Sunnah it's there, Ya Rabb. He said, yes, but you see, there's no contradiction in the Quran. So then I was watching on, I was like, wow, did you just literally attribute contradiction between the Quran and Sunnah? Well done. Traditionalism has won the day, right? This is the problem. You use weak arguments. You set up the Quran and Islam to fail. As soon as someone sees the hole in your argument, the whole thing falls down. Because you didn't just say, this could be a meaning. This could be indicative. You're saying if it had been contrary to this, there would have been a contradiction in the Quran. Now what did you do? You proved that there's a contradiction in the Quran according to your faulty argument. Right? Ad hoc arguments. False certainty. This is related where we say about a particular ayah that it means such and such. The scientific miracles depend upon this type of certainty. Because if you think about it, to say that a certain thing was said by the Quran, you have to say, well, definitely the Quran is saying this. It's not really impressive to say, you know, the Quran might have said that there was a Big Bang. Oh, I'm going to take Shahada right now. No, I have to say the Quran did say there's a Big Bang. The Quran does say that the universe is expanding. The Quran does say that the embryo is like this and like that. He would say it might. I haven't done anything. It's part of the industry. It's part of, like, once you enter into a particular activity, you have to follow the rules of it. And one of the rules here is you have to have certainty in what you are saying that the Quran means. And that is where I come in defense of tafsir, because in the field of tafsir, very little is certain like that. Tafsir is an area of exploration. It is an evidence-based inquiry. There are different possibilities within the text, and scholars will generally tell you about those different possibilities, and then they will tell you why they might favor one view over others. But certainty is not a frequent occurrence in tafsir. And hafs normativity, this is a word that I made up. It's actually been quoted in, like, proper academic journal papers now. In conferences, they're mentioning hafs normativity, and then they're crediting that guy off Twitter, that's me, that said it, right? So hafs normativity is where you mistakenly act as though a particular reading of the Quran, which is called Hafs and Asim, the one that we mostly all recite by, that you treat that as if it is the Quran, it is the only Quran and nothing but the Quran, right? So you are acting as if Quran equals Hafs. And this, in most of our daily lives, is not really an issue or a problem. But what's interesting is sometimes the argument that's made, the ad hoc arguments that are made, depend on ignoring all the other qira'at. So I'll give you a kind of example of this. This what I'm sharing to you is actually from the Itqan chapters that I translated, and the footnote comes from my PhD thesis actually. So from Ikramah, it is related that when there is a barrier in the Quran made by Allah, it is called Sudd. And when there is a barrier made by people, it is called Sadd. So that is as if to say, when the Quran says the word Sudd, it means a mountain. And when it says the word Sadd, it means something which is a man-made construction, a wall, a barrier, right? So you're already thinking about stories in the Quran where there's a Sadd, right? We're thinking about Dhul Qarnayn, and he is building a Sadd for the people in his third place that he visited, right? So this, by the way, is not a claim of a miracle, just to be clear. But this is the format that a lot of claims take. That's why I think this is interesting. Because you can imagine someone could say, Subhanallah. This is how that was began. You see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala so perfectly in his speech, whenever he wanted to talk about the barrier that he made, he called it Sudd. And whenever he wanted to talk about the barrier that people made, he called it Sadd. Allahu Akbar wa lillahi alhamd. Right? So this is the way that these arguments are constructed. Now, Shaykh Yusuf already knows where I'm going with this, because he's a Qur'at, reciter, mashallah. So I did the necessary digging, and I can see that out of the 10 Qur'ats, the four out of the 10 reciters, right? If you know about the 10 Qur'at and 10 Qur'a that are canonical and accepted, 4 of them use Sudd all through the Qur'an. Whenever the Sudd is mentioned, it is always called Suddan. So in that case, those people did not follow this rule, did not know about this rule, did not care about this rule. This rule means nothing to them. And then in the reading of Asim, we have Hafs and we have Shu'ba. In Shu'ba, it's always Sudd. In Hafs, it's always Sadd. So this is not Hafs normativity, in fact, this is something else. Because this rule does not apply to Hafs, just to be clear. Ikramah did not recite with Hafs, clearly. The 2 occurrences in Al-Kahf, 93 and 94, refer respectively to the mountains and to a barrier which Dhul Qarnayn was asked to construct. So we would then expect, according to this rule, that the first one should say bayna Suddayni, right? And the second one should be Sadda. And you can find that in the readings of Al-Kisa'i, Hamza and Khalaf, all from Kufa, they do go from Suddayni to Saddan, which is consistent with the narration from Ikramah. However, they do not follow this rule throughout the Quran, because in Surah Yasin, they say Saddan, despite it being the fact that God has placed a barrier in front of them and behind them. Unless you say, oh, actually what we meant is mountains and not man-made barrier, Allah made barrier, God made barrier. So we can say that maybe they are consistent. The remaining two readers, Ibn Kathir of Makkah and Abu Amr of Basra, recite Sadd in Al-Kahf and Sud in Yasin, and I cannot find a way to square that with the rule or to provide any explanation other than Sadd and Sud are basically the same, and it is fine whether you recite it Suddan or Saddan. It all amounts to the same. It's all acceptable. It's all permissible in the different ikhtiyar that they made. So I want you to keep this in mind when you hear certain claims. Does it pass the qira'at test? When they say to you, for example, every rih in the Quran is for punishment, every riyah is for mercy. First of all, it doesn't pass the Hafs test. There is an exception to it. But it even more comes into trouble once you factor in the different qira'at, because in the same place, certain people will say rih and some people will say riyah. Both of them are fine, both of them are accepted, both of them are right, but they don't all follow the rule in the same way. So here, when I said in defense of tafsir, I want to think about what does a mufassir actually do? And, I read a mufassir like Al-Razi, or I read a mufassir like Ibn Ashur, right? Very different eras. I'm going to share something from each of them, inshallah, just after this. So a mufassir here, I'm using to stand in for scholars in general who are studying the Quran. The first thing that they do is establish the text. Establish the text, I don't mean here to invent the text, obviously. It is revealed, it is transmitted from the Prophet ﷺ to his Sahaba. But you know also that there was a certain amount of variation in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, represented by the 7 ahruf, right? The 7 ahruf, meaning a degree of flexibility, of variation, divinely ordained, divinely supervised. The Prophet ﷺ was overseeing what was happening, and he himself perhaps has recited in multiple ways. People have heard him in different ways. They have also adapted things to their dialectal norms, and they have heard something and elaborated something. And then we come to a period where we have something called ikhtiyar. And ikhtiyar is where a particular qari says, well, I am going to, based on the available possibilities, recite it with this combination. So some of them might have said, well, I really like to think of the mountains as being called Sud and the man-made barriers as being called Sad. So since both these are transmitted, I'm going to follow this pattern wherever the word occurs, right? This is ikhtiyar. And, this is still something which people find a bit difficult to process because of the way that we have sometimes been told about the history of the Quran and the preservation of the Quran. But in short, I want you to really understand that this is the preservation of the Quran, and this is the way that the Quran was preserved, is that these people who were also knowledgeable about all the sciences of the Quran, and they were knowledgeable of the grammar of the Quran and the language of the Arabs, they're the people who made these choices between different options. And they helped us to receive the Quran in the way that we have it now, including in the 7 and 10 recitations. But my point is here, before even getting to explain the text, the mufassir is in a way looking at the text and saying, which version of the text am I engaging with here? Which part am I explaining? Am I explaining it as Sud or am I explaining it as Sad? They're doing also i'rab of the Quran. How do I see this sentence? Where do I see the beginning and end of the sentence, right? The syntax of it. And then based on that, I'm able to then elaborate more on the meaning of the text. So the second thing, and this is the most obvious thing, the main thing that the Mufassir does, is to explain the text. Now, explaining the text could be done in a supposedly objective or critical way, right? A few of us are going from here down to London. The next few days we'll be spending rubbing shoulders with some of these people who feel or claim to be very objective in their study of the Quran because they're like Al-Walid, Kuffar, right? So there's going to be people who feel that they're doing an objective study of the Quran, whereas as Muslims, we don't aspire to that type of objectivity where every option is on the table. When we encountered that ayah in Surah Al-Najm, right, there's one option that was never on the table for us, and that is, oh, this ayah is actually in the wrong place, right? The thought wouldn't even cross our mind. Instead, as Muslims and as Muslim scholars, you assume that this is actually the best of speech. And then you find the explanation that helps you to see that it's the best of speech, right? In the qira'at, although it's a very vast topic for us to, we don't want to get too sidetracked into it. But again, in the qira'at, especially in the early stage, there were certain readings that certain mufassirs would look at and say, I honestly cannot really make much sense of this qira'ah in this form. And since there's another qira'ah available, I consider that one to be more reliable. Right? So they would even criticize things, which, as we know, there's lots of qira'at that fell out of favor altogether, and we know them as the shawad, right? So we know them as the non-canonical readings, or the aberrant readings, or the isolated readings. And they fell out of favor, and they're not considered to be part of the Quran. But even the things that did actually make the cut, and we have them as part of the 7 and the 10 qira'at, there are some specific words and specific ayahs where certain mufassirs said, I don't actually like this way of reading it, and I think it shouldn't be read this particular way. And we can then go back and criticize those mufassirs and criticize those grammarians and say that they were wrong to make their attack on the qira'at. But in their time and place, it was reasonable for them to say what they said, right? It's only later that things reached a level of stability where now these are the 7 qira'at and these are the 10 qira'at, and there's no more debate over that. So now we would say, okay, this particular tricky qira'ah, there's something difficult to understand, but we're going to make every effort to understand it, and we're going to go deep into the annals of the diwan of the Arabs and the register of the poetry and find the shahid, the witness that we can call up into the court and say, yes, actually it's okay to break between a mudaf and mudaf ilayh, right? And we can find that. Why would we do it? Because it's the Quran. So what I'm saying is that we don't approach this in a purely objective way. We do something which I'm describing here as tawjih. Tawjih means I will find the way that this actually works, and I will make it make sense, because I assume that it does make sense. And if I'm struggling to make sense of it, I will work harder. I will work harder to make sense of it, because it is worth it, because it is Allah's word. So this was my problem here, and what we're probing about subjectivity and objectivity. Muslim scholars do not have that type of objectivity where all options are on the table, nor should they. Ta'weel is another aspect, and this is relevant to science. If you find that something on the face of it, the zahir, you know the word zahir? The apparent sense of something, the most obvious way that comes to your mind when you read it, that this would result in something impossible, or let's start to say now maybe unscientific, then we can say, is there another meaning available for this? Is there a ta'weel available? So I can take it away from its zahir, and I can see it as meaning something in majaz. Who's done a basic book of balagha? Anyone studied any text of balagha? Yeah? Not many of you. So there's an example that comes up, like in Surah Nuh, for example. جَعَلُوا أَصَابِعَهُمْ فِي آذَانِهِمْ. They placed their fingers in their ears. Right? So this is one of those classic examples they like to give, where they say, well, of course they didn't place their whole finger in their ear, because then they would burst their eardrum and it would cause damage to the inner ears. So what does it mean if they place their fingertips in their ears? So they consider this an example of taking away from the zahir towards, away from haqiqah even, towards majaz, towards metaphorical and figurative usage, right? So if you take that as the case, you start to see that actually this is something that permeates all through the Quran, and in fact all through the language that we speak as well, and in English. So not on purpose, the last few sentences that I've said, you could find lots of examples of majaz in them. When I said all through the Quran, here I'm comparing the Quran to like a substance or a place that you can go through, and so through the speech, it permeates, right? All of this is isti'ara, and metaphorical usage of language is everywhere. And when I said everywhere, also I did it again. And we use it round the clock, and that's a majaz as well, right? You can't escape it. That's majaz as well. So this is just completely normal to language. Don't let people tell you that, okay, only Ash'aris do majaz, or, you know. This is basically everywhere, right? So ta'weel, it means to understand things sensibly. You know, sometimes our children, you know, take things too literally. And sometimes as well, if they're being insolent, they'll do it on purpose to wind us up. Yeah, that's another one, wind us up. So if I said, you know, if I told someone to put their fingers in the ears, I said, well, I can't exactly push it all the way into my ears, can I? So that would be taking things literally out of context, and it's unjustified. You're supposed to understand sensibly what it means to put your fingers in your ears. You shouldn't need to be an advanced graduate in ta'weel to know how to understand it. We do this naturally. So that is what we call a charitable reading or a sensible reading. That's how I'm putting it. When you're reading the Quran, you don't take everything literally as the basis. That's what some people will tell you, by the way. This is like supposed to be a rule. And I have a lot of problem with this rule. The rule is you take everything literal unless you are forced to go to majaz. And then you can accept some majaz here and there, right? But I think in speech that is not normal. Maybe we can say in the ayat of ahkam, where there's like a legal instruction, this is the point that's being made. Don't jump towards metaphorical readings of things. When there's a literal meaning available, then that's obviously what we should consider intended by God, that he's telling us to literally, for example, wash your hands and your face, right? He's not saying, you know, blow on your hands, or he's not saying, you know, wish that your hands were clean. He's saying, wash your hands, and there we're going to need water. We should not jump towards metaphorical meanings. But in many things that we're reading in the Quran, now we're going to start to think about the descriptions of the heavens and the earth. Why should we insist on a metaphorical meaning? Why should we insist on a literal meaning until we are forced to see a metaphorical one? Isn't it quite appropriate to think that metaphor is in play? I put in the brackets e.g. takhsis because if you've studied any usul al-fiqh, you'll be familiar that you have certain things which are am and universal, and there are things which are universal, but there's another text that specifies it or limits the scope of it. This is al-am al-mukhassas, right? And then they say there's something called al-am alladhi urida bihi khusus. So something which is stated in general terms, but you're supposed to understand from the general rule of things, and you could say from reason, but just from being sensible and not excessively literal, you're supposed to understand that it doesn't refer to every single case, right? So I'm just pointing to where you can find this type of idea that I'm talking about in our Islamic sciences. With me so far? Yeah? Do I have to make more jokes, or we're okay? All right, we'll see. So the third thing that a mufassir could do, doesn't always do, but can do, is to praise the text. That is to say, I've talked to you about the meaning, now I want to say, and this is as perfect as it could be. Look how beautiful this is. Look how amazing this is. Look how powerful this is. Look how effective this is. And that is not a basic function of tafsir, but it's something that a scholar might well, you know, give space to and engage in to get the audience to get the benefit, the readership to get the best benefit. And you can find that there are works which are known as tafsir bayani, or by other names as well. But this is basically where a person is kind of combining explanation of the Quran with praise of the Quran. And I personally feel that this is a very difficult tightrope to walk, because the number 2 part assumes that I have to actually be open to the different ways that this could be understood, including ways that are more difficult. And then the other part is just like, I have to assume that the Quran is perfect as it is. So one of them is about being open to possibilities. The other one has to have a very absolute attitude to the perfection of the Quran. So I'm not sure if I can flesh this out fully, but I think that there's a tension between these two functions that you do find in some works. Right, so let's get into a bit of science, right? But this is a bit old science now. Here's Imam al-Razi. He died in 1210 of the Gregorian era. And he is talking about Surah Al-Kahf, the famous ayah where Dhul Qarnayn is going to the west, and he reaches what's described as the setting of the sun. Maghrib al-Shams, وَجَدَهَا تَغْرُبُ فِي عَيْنٍ حَمِئَةٍ. And the translation would be something like this, and he found it setting in a pool of murky water. So Imam al-Razi says, it is established through evidence that the earth is spherical and that the sky surrounds it completely. So one can have a debate as to what is the cosmology of the Quran. Does the Quran consider the earth to be round? Does it talk about it that way? Does it talk about the earth being flat? Are there some verses that seem to go this way, some verses that seem to go that way? Which ones would we prefer? And what will we base that preference on? Will we base that preference purely on science? Will we base it on internal textual evidences and the Sunnah? Will we be like Imam al-Suyuti and write a whole book called Al-Hay'at al-Saniyya, Al-Hay'at al-Sunniyya, and talk about how, astronomy should be known through the Mi'raj and not through, observing. And there are people, by the way, who are still flat earth Muslims and still earth Muslims. And there might be some in the room. Don't look around you just now. Some people are. The ones who are getting angry with what I'm saying, that's the flat earth ones, right? So this actually still exists. And part of the reason is, look, certain ayat are, they're talking about the world in this way. So on what basis are we going to accept, Thanks to NASA, Bill Gates, who are we going to believe? So Imam al-Razi, all these centuries ago, said, it is established through evidence that the earth is spherical and that the sky surrounds it completely. So it doesn't make sense now for him to think that there's a place then that's the extremity of the earth where the sun could set. There's also no doubt that the sun exists in its orbit, its falak. And this could be understood within the late Near Eastern cosmology of the spheres of the sky. You might see that he's talking about that. The verse appears to state that there were people positioned near the sun, which cannot be. He just takes it for granted. It cannot be that anyone was over next to the sun. Moreover, the sun is many times larger than the earth. He knows that as well. So how could it conceivably enter one of the earth's bodies of water? Very, very good question. With all this in mind, we can say that the phrase, which appeared to him to be setting in a murky spring, can be explained as follows. So he gives two explanations. I've just quoted the first of these. This is from our forthcoming translation, by the way, of Tafsir of Surah Al-Kahf, of al-Razi. When Dhul Qarnayn reached a certain point in the west, beyond which there were no habitations, he saw the sun appearing to set in a dark gorge, a wahda, as he says, even though it was not so in reality. This is like a sailor who observes the sun descending as though into the sea, if he cannot see the shore. The reality is that it is setting behind the sea as such, and it is proceeding in its path. Here, I'm not 100% clear on whether Razi understands the earth to be spinning and the sun to be, relatively still in that respect. Because that would follow from understanding that the sun is many times larger, and how can it be going around the earth when it's many times larger? It would have to be traveling extremely fast, I suppose, for that to work. So maybe he understands that the earth is spinning, but I don't see him kind of making that point out loud. He goes on to argue against the flat earthers. He says the people of narrations, Ahlul Akhbar. So I'm not sure precisely who is intended here, but he refers to them as Ahlul Akhbar. They said that the sun does indeed set in a spring full of water and clay. However, this is extremely implausible. Look at the evidence. If we track the news of a lunar eclipse and find that the Westerners, that's not British people, that's probably like the Maghrib, right? Report that it occurred in the early evening, and the Easterners report that it was at daybreak, we can conclude that the evening in the West co-occurs with the onset of the following day in the East. Indeed, the onset of evening at our location corresponds to late afternoon in another land, early afternoon in another, morning in another, sunrise in another, and midnight in yet another. So it seems remarkable to us, maybe because we have a certain conception about people in the past. They knew nothing about nothing. And in reality, the earth being round was known long before Ar-Razi. And it was known by Muslims. And Ibn Hazm talked about that. And some mentioned that there's something like consensus on that. And that was probably known by other communities before the Muslims as well. He says, since these realities are known based on observation and study, and we realize that the sun is up and observable somewhere at all these times, the suggestion that it disappears into clay and sludge goes against decisive facts. And this is crucial. This cannot be said about the speech of God. So it is incumbent to resort to such interpretation as we have mentioned above. So you see, there's a zahir, there's an impossibility of that zahir, and then there's ta'wil. Right? So the starting point is, it appears to say something, and then we say, we have good reason to think it's not saying that. I'm not changing God's words, I'm trying to understand God's words, because I don't think God would tell me that the sun sets on earth in a muddy pool. And I would be that insolent child if I act as though that's what he must be saying, because that's what you said. Literally, it's what you said. Yes, literally. But who told you to read everything literally? Right? So I have to then resort to the best interpretation. This is tawjih and ta'wil. But you see how this is going to go against the idea of scientific miracles, because scientific miracles requires everything that's zahir to actually be the correct meaning. Right? So, in fact, this contains a miracle that the Quran told us that the sun does set in the murky world. Even if we don't know it yet, we're going to know it in the future. One day we will discover that the sun does set in a murky pool upon earth. This would have to be, of course, I'm sure no one says that, but this would be a kind of logical thing following from what they say, right? Because they're assuming that the Quranic text is super clear and univocal and has one meaning. And we're pointing out that you actually have to do tawjih of things which would be otherwise difficult to understand, or would be wrong if taken at face value and interpreted literally, would be wrong, decisively wrong. So recently I was reading Ibn Ashur in Surah Al-Baqarah, translating it, in fact, translating the Quran according to his tafsir. So I'm discovering a lot of really interesting things that he talks about. One of those, when he's talking about هو الذي خلق لكم ما في الأرض جميعا ثم استوى إلى السماء فسواهن سبع سماوات. There's a number of interesting things here, including he thinks the سبع سماوات are the 7 other planets in the solar system. But that's not what I'm going to talk about just now. It's the issue of thumma. He created for you everything on earth. Then, thumma is literally then. ثم استوى إلى السماء. Translation is going to be something like, then he gave attention to the heaven, to the sky, and formed it into 7 heavens or 7 skies. So thumma, we would normally jump to thinking means that something came after, then, later. But Ibn Ashur points out that normally when one sentence is added by thumma, we are not supposed to immediately think about chronology and time. We're supposed to think about how one thing is following from another in mention. It's called at-tarahi al-rutbi. So it's like moreover. Yeah, I think even Yusuf Ali's translation is like that. Moreover. What's more? The next thing that I'll mention, even more interesting, even more impressive, I'm going to tell you the next thing is even greater than what I just told you. That's the idea of thumma, the concept of thumma. But it can also be for sequence in time. It can be both together, right? So here he says, this is a crucial quote, if the skies were created after the earth, then the chronological sense is also intended. But if the heavens came first, then it is only rutbi, it's only order of mention, and this is more evident here. So you see, it's the scientific question, it's the question of the fact of the matter that is guiding his interpretation. That's not unusual, by the way. It's not like Ibn Ashur is the only one doing this. It's just only sensible that I'll read it in the way that makes best sense. How do I know what makes best sense? Lots of different things and factors, including what is known through science. He talks about how the Salaf differed over this, because there are some ayat which seem to indicate that the heavens came before the earth, and others indicate that the earth came before the heavens. Okay? So this one seems to indicate the earth came before the heavens. Then in Surah Al-Nazi'at, بناها أنتم أشد خلقا أم السماء بناها رفع سمكها فسواها وأغطش ليلها وأخرج ضحاها والأرض بعد ذلك دحاها. And the earth after that, after the sky, I'm going to leave dahaha. This is another one of these claims of scientific miracle that it means egg-shaped, and then he made it egg-shaped. Because the earth is supposedly egg-shaped according to scientific miracle industry, but it's not. Anyway, dahaha, he then spread out the earth. So that ayah seems to be saying the opposite of what this ayah seems to be saying. So one of them has to yield to the other. Which one will we take as the basis? And which one will we do ta'wil of to kind of explain it in a different way? Ibn Ashur says, the stronger view is that the sky was created before the earth. Number one, because the expression وَالْأَرْضَ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ دَحَاهَا is more explicit in terms of order than this one is. Although he says, بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ can also be ta'wiled. Don't worry, if you want to, you can ta'wil the other one. If you want to, we can ta'wil just about anything. So as a secret between me and you, if we want to ta'wil it, we can ta'wil it. It all depends on where there's a ta'wil, there's a way, right? Where there's a ta'wil, write that one down. So he says, بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ is more explicit than ثُمَّ. So that's one argument. Secondly, because astronomers believe that the earth split off from the sun like the other planets of our solar system. Now he's appealing to science. And then thirdly, he appeals to the Bible. The book of the Genesis also presents this apparent sequence. So none of this is an absolute knockdown argument. He just says this is arjah. This is stronger. This is the better view. Not that it is the absolute truth and the other thing is absolute falsehood. But you see how the science features in his decision about how to interpret. I want you just to remember my core point here is, it has to work this way around rather than that the text is given as the basis for a scientific interpretation, which is then confirmed by science. In a way, some of the ayat were quote-unquote confirmed by the science and the other ones have to be ta'wil to fit the science. And that's okay because that's completely normal and that's what we do in tafsir. It's completely normal. Don't get upset about that. He says the Quran has used non-committal phrasing, uslub al-ijmal, to make its point here, to sidestep the dispute between the two sides. That's how I see his point. Rather than getting into which one came first, that's really not important in terms of the revelation of the Quran, the purpose of the point that it's making. Maybe if the Quran had absolutely stated one, some people would have said, well, the Quran is wrong actually. It's scientifically inaccurate because actually, the earth was created first, right? So there would be, those were actually people. And if you said, if the Quran had said it the other way around, that there were actually people on the other side would have got upset. So the Quranic expression is open to both. It is non-committal because the Quran did not come to tell you which one came first. It is not the point. Remember about missing the point? But for scientific miracle industry, the Quran came to make these points. At least for the purpose of creating a scenario of the scientific miracle that we're going to learn about. By the way, Ibn Ashur is actually on board with the idea of i'jaz al-ilmi, and he mentions it in a number of ayat that, and this is from the i'jaz of the Quran, the scientific i'jaz of the Quran. And again, he's using it a little bit loosely, but he's saying that the Quran is actually talking about certain things with a subtle accuracy, which couldn't have been known at the time, but later on we come to appreciate the accuracy of what the Quran said. And there was actually the author of the Quran clearly, the revealer of the Quran, clearly in fact did know about these things that other people did not know at the time. So he's actually on board with this concept and supports it and gives examples in the Quran. He uses the word i'jaz ilmi for something else as well. I was quite intrigued to find that even when it tells Bani Israel about their stories and their history, he calls this i'jaz ilmi as well, that the knowledge that the Quran contains of things that the rabbis thought that they had all to themselves, when it's revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, then he recites to them the stories of the past nations that they used to keep to themselves and gives them details that they didn't even know. He calls this i'jaz ilmi as well, because ilmi doesn't just mean scientific, it means knowledge-based i'jaz, right? Yeah, you can go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I found it interesting that Ibn Ashur took first recourse to the language, whereas Fakhruddin Razi went straight to science. Because, like, I've had that argument with someone at my university actually in SOAS, and I just said to them, Allah said, "Wajadaha taghrub fi inhabitant."
Yeah.
He saw it that way.
Yeah. So wajada, when it has two maf'uls, is to do with experiencing something.
But it's not Allah saying, this is how it is. It's saying,
yeah. You can, exactly. So in the ayah of Surah Al-Kahf, it's possible to explain it in a slightly different way. But actually, that is what Al-Razi is doing. He's just explaining why he's doing that in the first place. But why are we reading it as he found it, he observed it, or he saw that it was setting? It doesn't mean necessarily Allah saying, then it set in a pool of murky water, right? So these people who make this point always, they have to ignore the fact that the language does not say that, the sun did set in a pool of murky water. It says he got to the Maghrib. That would appear to mean the setting point of the sun. That's part of the issue. And he found it setting. And wajadaha taghrub, as two maf'uls, implies that he experienced it. So he might have even thought that was happening. It's possible. And the Quran is telling us about that for its higher reasons. Okay, so here's two concepts that I just want you to have very clear in your mind. Tafsir ilmi, i'jaz ilmi. Tafsir ilmi is essentially using science or using the knowledge of the day, including through observation and scientific theories, to inform tafsir. And that's what we saw Al-Razi doing. That's what we saw Ibn Ashur doing. They are saying, I could perhaps interpret the Quran in more than one way here. There are different possibilities. But the possibility that I'm going to say is correct. I'm going to bring in ilm, the ilm of the day, the science of the day, to help guide that interpretation. This is tafsir ilmi. And tafsir ilmi is not something strange, it's not something new, it's not something illegitimate. It is in fact what you should do. Because as I said, we want to interpret things in the most sensible way. And the sensible thing is not to go against things that are well established by modern science. While we all know that science is liable to change, that it could have things which later on are overturned, if we attach that scientific theory to the Quran definitively, this is one of the core problems of scientific miracles. If one day we are all saying that there's a Big Bang, and recently I mentioned this example in Edinburgh University, and someone said to me, actually nowadays scientists don't accept the Big Bang at all. And I said, I'd like to have that conversation with you later. I'm still catching up with the Big Bang itself, right? So 16 billion years is not enough for me to understand it. So, but if there is a case, if there is a theory that right now it's like everyone is sure about it, and we say, the Quran said this, it said this, 100% it's saying this is a Big Bang. And then in 50 years, everyone was talking about, remember that time we used to talk about Big Bang? What ridiculous idiots that people were back then. And, we just said that the Quran is definitely saying that. So the Quran is wrong now. We have just cancelled. Congratulations, you have just played yourself. And you have cancelled the Quran. And you have made the Quran scientifically wrong. But if you said it's a possible understanding of this, that when the Quran says, do the unbelievers not see that the heavens and the earth were once joined and we split them apart? This Big Bang actually helps us understand what that is saying. And maybe Allah is referring to that event. that is tafsir ilmi. That's fine. Because we can then come back from that later and say, oh, well, maybe it isn't. Because what did people think it was saying all these years is one of the core problems. What did people think? Like, they just had no idea what it was talking about. They had no conception of what the Quran was saying. And it took Hubble and his telescope to actually give us the knowledge of what the Quran was saying. This creates a problem. So this is I'jaz ilmi, is a new field which emerged. You might know some of the figures. Maurice Bucaille and his book about the Quran and the Bible and modern science. And figures like Abdul Majid Zindani with his video series that he did where he gathered a bunch of scientists and apparently maybe sort of tricked them into saying some stuff, which later on they kind of said, hey, I didn't actually mean it that way. And people like Dr. Zabul Najjar and others who have written on this subject, have talked on this subject. So I'jaz ilmi became a bit of an industry. Literally, there were organizations set up to promote it. And then it started to get a bit of a bad rep, and people have started to push back from within the Muslim context. And of course, from outside, where the people who have attacked it and used that to then, as I said, blow down the house of cards. When you build the foundation of faith upon weak arguments, you're opening us and you're opening the iman of your youth to attack. Because you built the faith on weak premises, you made it easy for someone to come and destroy that faith later on. You didn't build in them an appreciation of ambiguity and of flexibility and of how scholarship on the Quran actually works, or even just something consistent with that. You instead gave them false certainties, and you told them about colorful mountains and rainbow mountains, and that's what is talked about in the Quran. You told them about pulsars, and you told them about bees having multiple stomachs. That's the example I'm going to talk about. So there's a very nice paper by Hamza Sorsis, you may know of him. It's an old paper. Actually, I think he wrote more than 10 years ago. And I looked at again at it last night, and I said, actually, alhamdulillah, this is very nice. It covers the base very well. And on the left, we see a kind of summary of how a scientific miracle argument kind of goes. Number one, the Prophet ﷺ did not have access to the scientific knowledge mentioned in the Quran, therefore it must be from God. Number two, no one at the time of revelation had access to the necessary equipment to understand or verify the scientific knowledge in the Quran, therefore it must be from God. Thirdly, the Quranic verses were revealed at a time when science was primitive and no human could have uttered the truths mentioned in the Quran, therefore it must be from God. So these are things which can be individually challenged in individual cases, right? But this is the kind of the necessary background to constructing an argument for a scientific miracle, right? If we said, look, the Quran talks about the earth being round, if it talks about it, as I said, you can actually read it in more than one way. But let's suppose that it was so clear the Quran says the earth is round. Well, there were people before who believed the earth was round. A lot of times people make assumptions, not just Muslims, but we make an assumption about the ignorance of people in the past. And with further research, you come to realize actually people did realize a lot of things. They did have a lot of things right. Or if they didn't know for sure, certainly at least people believed that the earth was round. There might be more than one belief about that. We've sort of imbibed a certain, ironically, a Western triumphalist approach that everyone was so ignorant and thought that the earth was flat, and then Copernicus came and, right, the white people always are the ones who discovered it, right? So we have absorbed that and then we're misapplying it in our Quranic interpretation. So in the article, I'm not going to go through all of these points, but he tackles the problems in these headings. The fallacy of the undisputed middle, that's a sort of logical problem. Isn't there another possibility that you haven't considered here when you're putting a stark dichotomy between two things? Inaccurate history, I just touched on this. Teleology, or just say, what is the Quranic verse actually talking about? That was what I said before about missing the point. Scientism, the problem of induction and empiricism, these are some problems in the philosophy of science which also affect this maneuver. And scientific verses, I was talking to you about certain things that could be read on their zahir as going against science. What do? We do ta'wil of them. So then are we conveniently going to do ta'wil of the things that seem to go against science, but the things that confirm science on their zahir, we take them on their zahir. You see, I don't like this kind of dishonest approach. Let's be consistent, right? Let's be consistent. And the last point that he touches on is about Quranic exegesis itself. And that's where I want to give my focus. And I'm just really going to share 3 examples. We still got the energy? I put the videos in because I thought that you might find it more stimulating. So I don't want to bully any individuals or anything like that, but this is just literally something I saw on Twitter recently. And I thought, subhanAllah, this is someone vocalizing how the miracles in the Quran led him to Islam. And it's interesting because there are other people who vocalize now that this is what led them out of Islam. Not the miracles, but finding out that the house of cards was built on air. So let's just listen to it because I want us to reflect on what he says here.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. I hope you're having a beautiful, beautiful holy month of Ramadan. Now, many people ask me, what is it about the Quran that you find so appealing? What's so special about the Quran in my mind? Well, one of the things that I was fascinated to learn when I was being introduced to this beautiful holy text is that it's full of miracles. That's right. The Holy Quran is jam-packed full of miracles. One of my most favorite miracles from the Holy Quran can be found in the 16th chapter, which is titled The Bee. And if you turn to verse 68 to 69, it talks a little bit about the bee. Now, if you basically read into these verses, it talks about bees in very specific ways. In Arabic, in the Arabic language, it refers to honeybees, the bees that collect the honey, in the feminine. Now, back 1,400 years ago, no one would have recognized any significance in that. In fact, it would have been very strange, as many people would have assumed that it was male bees that were the worker bees, working class men. Islam is apparently a religion of misogyny. So why would they be saying in the Quran that it's the feminine, in the feminine? Well, now we know through scientific methods that actually the bees that collect honey are always female. That's something which has been proven. So the Quran is spot on, scientifically accurate there, but there's more. The Quran also goes on to talk about bellies. It refers to honeybees in the feminine, and they have bellies, so multiple stomachs. Now, again, that seems very strange. Why would it use the term bellies rather than belly, which, human beings have one, so why wouldn't we assume that all animals have one? Well, it turns out that, once again, the Quran is scientifically spot on, as we now know that honeybees have 2 separate stomachs, one designated specifically for honey production. So, once again, the Quran, absolutely spot on, scientifically 110% accurate, and this is just one of many examples where the Quran has gotten it scientifically spot on, and there are no contradictions between the Quran and modern science as we know it. How could the Arabs have known this 1,400 years ago, the inner workings of the bee and the gender of bees? Clearly, there is a greater power behind this book which knew how the world worked, because, of course, this book is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He is the creator of the universe. There you go, another beautiful miracle from the Holy Quran.
Wallahi, I hope that he didn't base his faith on that. Because the way he told us is that he's based his faith on that. And that's why I hope that he's not watching this video, right? Because then we're going to blow this one to pieces, right? So there was a post also that I spoke about on Twitter. And some people told me, why did you not hide the name of the person? And I was like, well, he should have hid his name, not me. So the point is, I'm not focused on the individual, I'm focused on the problem. And people should actually have this sense of embarrassment and shame before they put out things that are, full of nonsense. The Quran, apparently, according to the stresses that in the individual female bee, there are abdomens, i.e. more than one stomach, which in Arabic is butun. By the way, if the bee has 2 stomachs, then this is wrong, because butun is 3 or more. Unless we do ta'wil of it, right? To try to fit the science. But no, apparently the Quran is telling you the science. It's got multiple butun. So when they found that it's got 2 stomachs, we should have said, well, the Quran contains a scientific error based on the method here. Butuniha points to a single female bee. No, it doesn't. Not at all. If it was supposed to refer to multiple bees, then the plural feminine pronoun, hunna, which is spelled wrong, would be connected to the verb butuni ha. This is wrong. This clearly shows, no it doesn't, that the noun stomach is plural and the pronoun used is for third person feminine singular, it means feminine. This thing that a female worker bee has multiple stomach portions, not known until very recently, only this one fact, this is what I was saying to you at the beginning. Is one fact enough? Because once I knock this one down, we can go to a different one and we can keep chasing after the scientific miracles until we find one that works. Only this one fact is enough for any person to believe in the divine origin of the Quran. And I didn't believe that until I watched this video. But let's go into it in the tafsir. So I'm not just going to just dispute. I will go to the books and see what did they say about these butuniha. In the past, were they sitting there saying, why does this say that bees have multiple stomachs? Ajib. We need someone to come some centuries later with modern science. By the way, they could dissect a bee. It's not that hard. Does it really require, anyway. So were they of the view that this is saying that bees have multiple stomachs? If not, why not? And if there's another way of understanding it, then why don't we just assume that that other way is right? Why would we assume that it's saying that a bee has multiple stomachs? Notice from the beginning. وَأَوْحَى رَبُّكَ إِلَى النَّحْلِ أَنِ اتَّخِذِي مِنَ الْجِبَالِ بُيُوتًا. So it's telling not one bee, but the bees to take houses. It's not telling one bee to take multiple houses. You see how that's absurd? And اتَّخِذِي, this feminine singular is being used for all the bees. This is something which is called ism jins jam'i. And ism jins jam'i, something like nakhl as well, it is allowed in the Arabic language to use the feminine singular and to use the masculine singular. So for example, here on the right, you see a little bit of the example. In one place, the nakhl is used in the masculine, أعجاز نخل منقعر. In the other ayah, كأنهم أعجاز نخل خاوية. خاوية in the feminine. So each of these is correct according to the Arabic language and in the Quran. So أن اتخذي, all the bees are being told. And then بطونها means from their bellies. Very simply. They always understood it this way. They were right to understand it this way. The scientific, so-called pseudo-scientific explanation is wrong. And you see why I'm emotional about it. This is tahrif of the Quran. You're actually distorting the meaning of the Quran. You're actually telling me some things that are wrong in the Arabic language. And all for what? For the bees' bellies. So now we're going to not any longer know about ism jins jam'i and how it works. And we're not going to understand a'jazu nakhlin khawiyan and a'jazu nakhlin munqa'ir. We're not going to understand it because we're going to have these new rules. Somebody once was making this, a silly interpretation of the Quran. I said to him, well, that doesn't work because you can't say وَإِذَا الْعِشَارُ عُطِّلَتْ. He was trying to say al-ishar could be in the meaning of mu'ashara. Right? Nonsense. Nonsense. Don't try to think about it. Don't let it go in your head. But when I said to him that doesn't work because then it would have to be إِذَا الْعِشَارُ عُطِّلَ. He said no, because masdars are non-binary. Because the masdars don't have a gender. So I was like, do you love your interpretation so much that you're willing to destroy the Arabic language to defend it? And that's what happened in the post that we read. He destroyed the Arabic language and the English language at the same time. Ism jins jam'i can be treated as masculine or feminine. And as Shaykh al-Khafaji makes clear in his gloss on al-Baydawi, the bees is treated feminine according to meaning, as though to say طَائِفَةٌ مِّنْهُ وَجَمَاعَةٌ. Okay, you ready for another video? Right. By the way, I'm not sure that I'm picking here the best examples or the worst examples. They're just examples that at some point have triggered me, as you can see. And so I'm putting them on you now, right? But I don't believe that these are particularly worse than other things. I think they are pretty representative. There might definitely be examples where someone has just been much more sensible in the way they framed it, and examples that are stronger in the Quran. I'm not here trying to strawman the whole thing, But I'm picking some examples so you can see the kind of things that can go wrong.
A pulsar is a highly magnetized, rotating neutron star that emits a beam of electromagnetic radiation. The first pulsar was observed on November the 28th, 1967, with the help of telescopes. The name pulsar is derived from pulsating star. The definition of pulsate is produce a regular, reoccurring throbbing sound. The word originates from the Latin word plare, which means to beat. They chose this name because scientists were able to record sounds of this star using high-end technology of the 20th century. The most astounding fact is that this star was described 1400 years ago in the Quran. In the 86th chapter of the Holy Quran, Allah describes a star named Tariq. Allah calls this star Tariq and calls it the star of piercing brightness. Now if we look at the pictures of the pulsar, we can clearly see a piercing light through the star. But there is more. Allah also called the star Tariq, which in Arabic means the beater or striker. Tariq is derived from the Arabic verb taraka, which means to strike or to beat. It also refers to someone who comes in the middle of the night and knocks on the door. You heard how the pulsar sounded in the beginning of the video, which scientists were able to hear using high-end technology of the 21st century. You can clearly hear the sound, which sounds like someone is striking or knocking on something. How could the Quran know this 14 centuries ago when there was no high-end technology? There is no doubt left, the Quran is a book from God, and Muhammad was his messenger.
So, anyway, I put some of the issues here. I've got the sense by now. What is our critique here? Saying that nobody would have understood is not a plus. That this Quran is so miraculous that people didn't understand it, and they had no idea what it was talking about. Pick up any tafsir, you will find them talking about was-sama' wa-tariq. Right? I've got a knock-knock joke here. Knock-knock.
You're tired today.
Tariq. You don't know how these jokes work? Okay, never mind. It's not a joke. That's just what tariq means, knock-knock. That's it. So look, tariq means knock. So the thing is that they understood that this means a night visitor. It's a star or something like a star that appears at night. And this would be identified with various things. It could be Venus, which is known as the morning star or the night star, even though it is in fact a planet. But classically has often been identified as though it's a star, because it would come at night. And when people would come back to a town, or they're visiting a place and they arrive at night, they wouldn't just go into the town, because then they could be seen as maybe up to mischief or an invader or something if they're caught. So they would get something, and they would, as they're coming in, they would knock. So that's why, as he correctly said, it means also someone who visits at night. So why do we have to then bring pulsars into it? Is it possible that the ayah in some way is also referring to pulsars? Maybe. But what we can't do is say, well, it's definitely talking about pulsars in order to construct the scientific miracles argument. Who is going to be convinced by that? Only someone that we managed to trick. Only someone that we managed to trick at the dawah table, took shahada, and later on, their faith will be destroyed when they watch this. So it's important to know that the Arabic Quran is an Arabic Quran. It uses certain norms of speech. At-tariq meant something to those people. They didn't hear it as by the sky and the knocker. What is the knocker? The star. What's the knocking star? They didn't get confused like this. They had a clear conception of what at-tariq meant. It also appeals to things that they know, and this is a general rule. The Quran is going to say, have they not seen that the heavens and the earth were once joined? Have they not seen? Do you not see in the sky? Do you not see the mountains and their different colors? It's appealing to things that they have seen and things that they see and things that they know in order to make a point to them. If they don't know what the Quran is talking about, then how is the Quran making its point? Last one. My favorite. And this one, by the way, like, it comes all the time. People keep repeating this one. I keep getting sent pictures of these mountains. The first thing I'll tell you, by the way, what you're about to see in the pictures is not in China. That's like, they have to get everything wrong. What you're going to see is mountains in Peru, not in China.
هناك يعني ظاهرة جميلة جدا لم يرها العلماء إلا حديثا جدا، وهي الجبال الملونة المخططة. سبحان الله، هذه الجبال الملونة موجودة في منطقة في غرب الصين، موجودة غرب الصين. تظهر وكأن هناك طرق قد لونت بألوان الأحمر والأسود والأبيض، طرق عريضة جدا وملونة ومخططة. الله تعالى أشار إلى هذه الجبال قبل 14 قرنا في آية لطيفة يقول فيها تبارك وتعالى: ألم تر أن الله أنزل من السماء ماء فأخرجنا به ثمرات مختلفا ألوانها ومن الجبال جدد. الجدد في اللغة العربية هي الطرق المخططة، هذا المعنى الدقيق لها، الطرق المخططة. ومن الجبال جدد بيض وحمر مختلف ألوانها وغرابيب سود. سبحان الله. النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام هل رأى مثل هذه الجبال؟ لا طبعا، هذه لا توجد في الجزيرة العربية ولا توجد في أي منطقة أخرى إلا في غرب الصين. عندما أنبأ القرآن الكريم عن هذه الجبال وحدد لنا ألوانها، عندما نرى مثل هذه المشاهد لابد أن الإنسان بالفعل يزداد إيمانه بالله عز وجل. من الذي أنبأ النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام بهذه الحقيقة؟ يعني سبحان الله، من الذي خلق هذه الجبال؟ من الذي أعطاها هذه الألوان الزاهية؟ إنه الله تعالى الذي قال: صنع الله الذي أتقن كل شيء إنه خبير بما تفعلون. سبحان الله.
So I want you to remember these three things: meanings, manifestations, and miracles. Meaning of the Quran is what tafsir does. Let's look at the words, let's look at the possibilities, let's understand this in the best possible way, using all the tools that we have in Usul al-Tafsir, and let's bring in the knowledge of the world as well. Tafsir ilmi. Meanings, good. Manifestations. When Allah Azza wa Jal talks in Ayah 27 of Surah Fatir, that you see tracks in the mountains, red, white, and black. By the way, when you saw those mountains, did they look red, white, and black, or they were like all the colors of the rainbow? Do you really feel it's the same thing? I don't. But maybe upon seeing that, we say, SubhanAllah, you see how Allah talked about those tracks in the mountains? This is even more varied in its colors. And Allah created this as well. And Allah told me to appreciate His creation and the diversity therein, even the colors within the mountains, the Arabian mountains that they all saw, the tracks and the colors within it. But you know what? There's even mountains that are even more colorful and amazing than that in Peru and China, and apparently in Iran now I've seen that as well. So, manifestations. This is manifestations of Allah's signs in the creation. We can appreciate it on that level without saying, and that's what Allah Ta'ala ashara ila hadhi al-jibal. And thirdly, miracles. Miracles requires this construction of an argument which is not going to work. To say that the Prophet ﷺ, could not have known this because he didn't travel to China. So how did he know about colorful mountains? I'm sorry, you've just misapplied as to what the Quran is talking about. Final thing, recommendations. Study the world in all its forms, and use this to help you understand the revelation and use it to help you appreciate the revelation, right? The meanings and the manifestations. And any argument that we make to a skeptic or indeed someone that we are doing da'wah to, any argument that we make, test it, critically first. Have I applied some ad hoc reasoning? Have I applied false certainty? Is there an objection that can come to this? Then consider that objection first. Like the great minds of our tradition have done, like Imam al-Razi does all the time. He's telling you something that says, well, you might object that such and such. Well, this is the answer that I would give to that objection. I saw you coming, and I have an answer to that objection. Always we should be steps ahead. We shouldn't be the ones who get embarrassed because we said something that we hadn't looked into, hadn't tested, and then someone throws it back in our face. And we have then embarrassed not just ourselves, but of course, we have placed the deen in that unfortunate position. Barakallahu feekum. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.